I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at the university. My job is to welcome you all onto our campus and to this inaugural International History Lecture, which, as Bill said, is a partnership between the university and Litfest. We're really excited to get this piece of work off the ground. We have a fantastic speaker this evening, which we're looking forward to in different kinds of ways. But my job this evening is to be here as Dean, to welcome you to the university. And as I do that, I have to remind you all of the importance of arts, humanities, and social sciences in public life, because that's part of my role. I'm a keen advocate for these disciplines and what they bring the world. These subjects don't always have the easiest of times in the current political climate. But for those of you who've journeyed here this evening, I'm sure you'll agree, I hope, that those disciplines can thrill, confuse, give you goosebumps, challenge you, encourage us to think about the world in new ways and address the difficult and prickly problems that we all face in ways that other disciplines cannot. History, I think, as a humanities and as a humanitarian discipline is really important to me and the mission of this university. So it's a great pleasure to be able to welcome you onto our campus in the name of history and in a partnership with Litfest. The other thing I wanted to say was to welcome students from sixth form colleges who've come from around the region this evening, but some have come from as far away as Cumbria. So welcome to our campus to be here. You know who you are, and it's lovely to see you here. So thanks very much. I'm going to pass to my colleague, Professor Will Pettigrew, who's going to introduce the lecture and our speaker for this evening. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ed. I don't usually get introduction fatigue, so I'll keep it brief. Absolutely thrilled to see everybody here. Delighted to meet and to welcome Sathnam. Thrilled to formally welcome Sathnam Sanghera and to invite him to inaugurate this Lancaster History Lecture before this excellent festival campus crowd. I don't think I've seen this room as full of this, which isn't a reflection on anything, but to welcome, to show how broad the welcome is for Sathnam. Sathnam has proven eminent, popular, and hugely influential as a writer across multiple genres, from financial journalism to memoir, fiction, television writing, children's writing, as well as most recently 2 books about the 21st century repercussions of the British Empire. We warmly welcome Sathnam to Lancaster, and we look forward to tonight's talk titled How British Imperialism Has Shaped the Globe. Sathnam, over to you.
Great. Thanks. Thank you for that introduction, Ed, Bill, and Will. Thank you for getting my name right. I normally get called things like Satan or Samantha. Satnav is a very common one now. Shatman, that happens. But anyway, thank you for inviting me and getting my name right. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you today about the legacies of the British Empire. I've been talking and writing about British imperialism now for around half a decade, and if there's one thing I've learnt, it is this: people disagree about it quite intensely. Seriously, if you're in a mood for a fight, talk about the British Empire. There's very little about the biggest empire in history that is not contentious. People argue about what drove its expansion. Was it to make money? Was it to spread British values? Or was it just because there were parts of the world there available to conquer? People argue about when it ended. Did it end during the independence of India on the 15th of August in 1947, or in the handing back of Hong Kong in 1997? Or perhaps, some people say, it never ended. Some people argue about when it reached its peak and how big it really got. And some people even question whether the British Empire even happened at all. Among these people is my former hometown MP Enoch Powell. In a twist that makes Lawrence Fox's journey from D-list actor to far-right activist feel unremarkable, this imperialist, whose life was shaped by the colonial mission, started to claim from the 1960s onwards that the British Empire had never really happened. He said it was a myth, a deception, and an invention all along. He said that people who had ever believed in the British Empire, whoever believed that the British Empire was one of the most extraordinary, he said that people had ever believed in the British Empire was one of the most extraordinary paradoxes in political history. He also insisted that England underwent no organic change as the mistress of a world empire. It was a really peculiar thing to say, especially for a man whose main ambition in life was to be the Viceroy of India. For a man who in 1947 famously tried to persuade Winston Churchill to impose martial law on India. But this view is arguably just an extension of remarks famously uttered by Sir John Seeley. He was the founding father of British imperial history, and you probably know the quote. He famously asserted in The Expansion of England that the British Empire was acquired in a fit of absence of mind. He argued, as many have since, that the British Empire was a bunch of accidents, errors, and unintentional consequences, and responses to accidents, errors, and unintentional consequences. And if you believe this, it's not much to go a bit further and say, well, the British Empire didn't really happen. For its worth, and this may come as a surprise, come as no surprise given I've written 3 books on the subject, and I'm here to talk to you about the British Empire, but I think the British Empire happened. It happened, let's get that out of the way. I think it happened. It was the biggest empire in human history, and it shaped the world and Britain in all sorts of profound and unprofound ways. And there's no shortage of evidence I can point to from just standing here at this lectern. In my cup here, I've got some tea, some Yorkshire tea, which I realise might not be popular in Lancaster. I'm not sure what you guys drink. Is there Lancashire tea? There is. Is there a brand called Lancashire tea? Oh my God. I was going to say there's a gap in the market, but there isn't. But guess what? The tea in the tea bags in this cup does not come from Yorkshire. No. The tea, as the website for the Yorkshire tea explains, thank God, the tea in these tea bags is a blend of tea that comes from up to 20 different parts of Africa and India, many of them former British imperial territories. And it was British imperialists who not only made tea a national drink in Britain, but they also made tea a national drink in India, something I hadn't realized until very recently. Of course, given the time of day, I could have got away with drinking something a little harder from the bar. I don't know how far the bar is, but probably not very far, given we're at university. I could have had some gin and tonic. And there's no greater imperial legacy than tonic. Tonic famously contains quinine, quinine being the chemical which allowed imperialists to survive the worst effects of malaria and then to go on to colonize large parts of Africa and Asia. I could have had a rum and coke, my favorite drink when I was 19. Rum is a great imperial legacy. Molasses, the residue left over from sugar production after it's been crystallized from sugar cane juice, enabled the creation of rum on Barbados, where the British industrialized the production of sugar using the enslaved. Rum was a product of both of continental European, British, African, and Amerindian influence, all present on the island, though people argue about who actually created it. Other imperial legacies, looking at where this university is located, there's another imperial legacy in the national parks that we're surrounded by in this very beautiful part of the world. Imperial Britons often saw themselves as environmental stewards, defending the natural world. So organizations such as the Society for the Preservation of the Fauna of the Empire, which exists today in modern form as a charity called Fauna and Flora International, they convened international conferences, created game reserves in British colonies to preserve species that were under threat and to preserve nature. But often the imperialists who did this great charitable work had caused the environmental destruction in the first place, or they had hunted these animals to destruction or to the point of extinction in the first place. And often then they blamed indigenous people for the damage that they had caused. But nevertheless, they did set up environmental charities, and they set up national parks in places like New Zealand and Africa. And plans for parks in East Africa had been formulated in the 1930s, and having been put on hold during the war, were completed immediately after it. These imperial parks paved the way for similar initiatives back home with the 1949 National Parks Act, providing the way for the opening up of conservation areas in Britain. And there's other imperial legacies to be seen in Lancaster University. The field of geography. Are there any geographers in the room? A couple of geographers. Geography, as you'll know, is a famous legacy of European imperialism. It was set up by people who wanted to map out the world and understand the world. It actually existed as an academic subject before history. And when imperial history was first taught, it was through the academic discipline of geography rather than through history. The ties between anthropology and empire are also very deep. I think, Ed, you're an anthropologist. Is that right? Yes. Also, the study of English literature has something to do with empire too. English literature existed as an academic subject in India before it became an academic subject in Britain. And some of the materials used to teach English literature, and even Shakespeare, actually came from India. And then, of course, you have the racial diversity of the room. One of the main reasons Britain is such a multicultural society today is that the British Empire was highly multicultural. It gets forgotten, but the passengers on the Windrush arrived as British citizens. The 1948 Nationality Act enacted what had been true for decades, that anyone born in the empire had the rights of a British citizen, something that our civil servants failed to recognize, resulting in the Windrush crisis. Scandal. As the famous line goes, we are here because you were there. So our multiculturalism is a massive legacy of empire. But actually, when it comes to the global legacies of the British Empire, it's still pretty small fry. Yes, millions of people of colour now live in Britain because the British Empire had lots of people of colour and they came over here. But at the same time, the British Empire also enslaved 3 million Africans and sent them to work on plantations around the world and across the Atlantic. In Ireland, an estimated 1 million people died during the famine in Ireland under British rule in the late 1840s, and many more people were uprooted and resettled abroad. And actually, it's only recently that the population of Ireland has just recovered to its past size before the famine. 3 historians working together estimated recently that in total, the British were responsible for the deaths of over 1 million people between 1838 and 1880, during the First Afghan War, the First Opium War, the Indian Uprising, the Second Opium War, the Second Afghan War, and then the wars in South Africa in 1878 to 1880. Some 15 million people were displaced as a consequence of partition, and up to 2 million people died. Recent research has revealed that in over 140 years in Australia, there were at least 270 organised massacres of First Nations people, as a consequence of which the First Nations population was decimated, falling from around 1 to 1.5 million to less than 100,000 by the start of the 20th century. There was the wiping out of the indigenous people in Tasmania, of course. There was the wiping out of the indigenous people of the Caribbean, the so-called Caribs. The British sent 1 million Indians to plantations across the world in Mauritius, Guyana, and Trinidad to replace the enslaved after abolition. It's one of the reasons why there's a massive Indian diaspora. One of the main reasons why wherever you go in the world, there's an Indian, is because of Indian indenture, because the British sent so many Indians around the world. And there are more legacies, more imperial legacies, beyond all of this human geography. The influence of the British Empire can be felt in the daily lives of people across the planet. It explains the spread of the English language. One of the reasons why we don't bother learning other languages is because of the British language, because of the British Empire. Patterns of global tax avoidance go back to the British Empire. The spread of Christianity in West Africa. Now the most vibrant churches in London are often run by Nigerians who were converted to Christianity by British imperialists, and now they're trying to convert a secular Britain back to the faith that we have no interest in. The existence of entire nations, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, arguably Pakistan, the creation of entire cities like Nairobi, which was a former railway town, and colonial Bombay, the establishment of the discipline of tropical medicine that happened during the British Empire, the global system of time. Why does the Greenwich Mean Time line go through London? I mean, that's because of imperial attitudes. Ganja, that was one thing that really surprised me. Ganja is something you associate with Jamaica. You say it's an intrinsically Jamaican thing, right? But actually, if you think about the word, it's an Indian word. It's a Hindi word. And actually, it was Hindu or Indian laborers who took that plant to Jamaica, and then it became associated with the Jamaican culture. Similar with goat curry, that was something introduced to Jamaica by Indian indentured laborers. The British Empire can also be felt every day in our news agenda. You cannot pick up the paper without there being at least one or two major stories in the paper every day that can be explained by this history. The situation in Israel-Palestine is one we helped to create when in charge of the region after World War I. Basically, I mean, a lot happened, but essentially, in some very inexpert correspondence, we promised that region of the world both to the Arabs and to the Zionist Jews at the same time. There's an international dispute currently raging in Guyana about the borders of the country, with Venezuela contesting the borders which were drawn up during the British Empire. There was a recent referendum, very controversial referendum in Australia, aimed at giving the indigenous better representation, which generated huge controversy and upset when Australia voted no. That goes back to the British Empire. There are serious calls for reparations in Caribbean countries, which I'm sure you've heard about in the news. And frankly, you need to understand the history of the British Empire to understand the modern world. And I think you need to understand the history of British Empire to understand your daily life. But I know some of you will have a specific question in your mind when I talk about these legacies and I list them. And the specific question you have in your mind will be this: Are the legacies of the British Empire overall good or bad? I know some of you are thinking this because this has been the way that the British have always thought about the British Empire. People were debating whether the empire was good or bad when empire was happening. In more recent decades, there have been books by the likes of Neil Ferguson, arguing that overall the legacies of the British Empire were good. There have been books by Kwasi Kwarteng and Sashi Thoreau arguing that overall the legacies of the British Empire were bad. The former Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn announced in the run-up to the last general election that under his party, children would be taught about the historical injustice of British colonialism as part of the national curriculum. In contrast, Michael Gove announced early in his tenure as Secretary of State for Education that history lessons in schools needed to celebrate the legacy of the British Empire. This black and white way of viewing complex history has got us nowhere, and it gets us nowhere. It's like saying you want to study the history of the climate, but you're only going to study rain, or you're only going to study the sunshine. That's not going to give you a very good sense of what has happened in the climate of the last 300 years. It gets even more strange when this basic way of viewing really complex history turns into a balance sheet, when people try to balance the good that happened in empire against the bad, with the aim of coming to an overall conclusion about the greatness or the evil of empire, like this history is a phone case that you're reviewing on Amazon. It leads to some really bizarre and absurd arguments. So tell me, how many miles of Indian railway built by the British makes up for the 2 million deaths that happened during partition? How many free votes cast in the Nigerian elections since independence make up for the hundreds of thousands of deaths that came about during the Civil War caused by the way the British set that country up in such a crude way? At which precise point did the capitalism and the prosperity introduced by imperialists to North America begin to balance out the deaths of millions of indigenous people through disease and settler violence? How many animals saved in the national parks set up in Africa by British imperialists make up for the damage caused by the prickly pear disease in Australia? is such an absurd way of seeing the history. And this view of British imperial history, where our national history is forever being given an overall rating, where apples are forever being balanced against pears, feels more absurd than ever. And it makes no sense in particular because, as I discovered whilst writing my most recent book, the legacies are just profoundly contradictory. The British Empire resulted in the establishment in democracy in all sorts of places by complicated, often indirect means. But at the same time, it led to massive geopolitical chaos in other places like Sudan, Myanmar, and Nigeria. The British sometimes spread the rule of law, but they also institutionalized legal inequality in a way that means that millions of people still can't bank on justice today. The British Empire was undoubtedly a propagator of racism, but also it fostered racial cooperation. Sometimes when settler colonialists in Australia were behaving in a particularly evil, racist way, the imperialists in London would intervene and try to stop them from doing what they were doing. The British Empire both destroyed and saved large swathes of the global environment. It spread the free press, but it also spread press censorship. It propagated hunger and it combated hunger. It encouraged both education and willful ignorance. I know some of you will struggle with the idea that opposite things can be true at the same time. I did once. You might say, for example, that abolition doesn't make up for slavery. It's something that I would have said, say, 2 or 3 years ago when I wrote my first book on empire. After all, the British transported 3 million Africans across the Atlantic, and then on abolition liberated only, say, 800,000 people. So obviously, slavery was worse than the abolition. But someone on the other side of the argument might counter it on the grounds of saying, look, by passing the 1833 Emancipation Act, Britain saved millions, possibly billions of others from being enslaved. So you could say the 800,000 figure should be inflated by millions. I think it's much better to observe the discrete catastrophe of slavery and the discrete phenomenon of abolition and to study them separately. You don't have to balance them out. It might also feel superficially logical to say, look, the animal and nature preservation efforts made by British imperialists did not make up for the destruction they embarked upon with animals and nature. But this could be counted on the grounds that, over subsequent centuries, the number of animals saved and nature saved by national parks and charities actually far outweighs any damage they caused. And these kind of arguments are really hypothetical in the extreme, and I think far from illuminating. And I really do believe that we've got to give up on them and stop trying to balance things out against each other, although otherwise we will be driven mad. It's much better to simply accept slavery, anti-slavery, the destruction and preservation of animals and the environment as discrete phenomena in their own right and attempt to understand their very complicated, nuanced stories. It's much better at every single stage to seek nuance rather than come to some kind of generalized overall conclusion. British Empire was ultimately a mass of contradictions, and the legacies are ultimately contradictory too. Opposite things can be true at the same time. I really do believe that as an idea that can liberate you in understanding history, but also it can liberate you in your understanding of the people in your life who often aren't one thing. Whatever you say about your mum, the opposite is true to a certain degree. My friend and mentor, the imperial historian Professor Alan Lester, put it really well when I discussed this issue of the balance sheet with him recently. And he said to me, the empire is something that consists of trillions, infinite numbers of interactions between people, between groups. The same person in British Empire might be impacted negatively by colonialism in one day and positively the next. They can find themselves humiliated in the street by a white man or woman one day, and the next day call on the colonial police to sort out a dispute. People could be imprisoned or elevated in status at different stages of their lives. And he gives an example, Gandhi. Gandhi became, as we all know, one of the most famous enemies of the British Empire, but during an earlier part of his life, he was very much into many British imperial values when he was in South Africa, and at the same time, partook in some quite crude anti-black racism. But both things can be true at the same time. And I find that the idea that you can identify contradictory legacies without having to balance them out hugely liberating. Though obviously there is complexity within the complexity. It only goes so far. There are opposites within the opposites. There are certain facts about empire which are incontrovertibly uncomplex. When it comes to an institution like the royal family, for example, it's perfectly possible to observe that their involvement in slavery far outweighs their involvement in abolition. But when it comes to generalizing about British Empire as a whole, whatever you say about it, the opposite is true to a certain degree. To how much of a degree? Ultimately, it's unknowable. And accepting anything else, I think, will eventually tie you into intellectual knots. I really do believe that anyone approaching this history with an open mind will eventually come to this conclusion and accept the complex, contradictory nature of it all. The history resists simplistic explanations, and there's no better example of what I mean than Jan Morris, who wrote a deeply nostalgic and hugely influential trilogy on the British Empire, one of Boris Johnson's favourite books, a history which influenced David Cameron and a whole generation of Etonians. But she was asked about her trilogy towards the end of her life, and in an act of insight, she remarked that she was ashamed of what she'd said. However, having said all of this, seeing British Empire as an incredibly complex mass of contradictions doesn't prevent us from saying it's absurd to maintain, as too many people do, that the achievements of abolition mean that our national involvement in slavery should not be explored. I get accused of that all the time. People say, oh, well, we got rid of slavery, so why don't you shut up about the fact we ever did it? Neither does it stop us from observing that historians have for too long approached this history from the point of view of the colonizers and ignored the point of view of the colonized. It also doesn't stop us from observing that imperialists made concerted efforts to repress evidence of what happened. It doesn't stop us from observing that there is now an organized, well-funded campaign to shut down discussion of slavery and empire in Britain. It doesn't stop us from observing that anyone who attempts to talk about imperial history with real nuance is shouted down by cultural warriors of various stripes, keen on very basic views of history, not least Rishi Sunak, our Prime Minister, who recently said that historians should stop unpicking history. And I think the historians in the audience will agree that that is exactly what historians do. They literally unpick history, mate. Also, observing everything I've said doesn't stop us from observing that we need to pay more attention to what nations formerly in the empire are trying to tell us about how the British Empire shaped their development. It's time to abandon this very monochromatic way of seeing our imperial history once and for all. It's time to seek nuance wherever it's available. It's time for everyone, even those of us who think we know a lot, to challenge what we think we know and to be open to changing our minds sometimes. Thank you. There's now going to be a very awkward bit while we bring it out of the chairs. And I feel like I'm about to appear on Top of the Pops in 1988 and sing Lady in Red. Chairs, man.
Yeah, you go first.
Yeah, you don't want to hear that.
Thanks, Sathnam. So I'm very privileged to be able to start a conversation, or try and start a conversation with Sathnam. And I can hold the mic for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to open it up. I'm sure you're all very keen to ask some questions. But
I've got to say, it's weird for me to do this because you know way more about this subject than I do. And, Will's an amazing historian of slavery, and your books are incredible.
Well, that's, he's done this before.
You've got to learn how to take a compliment. Say thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So on the central issue of compressing complex histories into value judgments, the kind of balance sheet of history, I think most of us, all of us, could accept that as bad history. But I'm just thinking about the risks of dispensing with the balance sheet and the way in which I think the balance sheet idea is kept going, because there's something alluring about it in terms of wanting the present to be, the sins of the past to be balanced out in the present. So there's a kind of value judgment about good or bad in the past, but there's quite a lot of emphasis in the way we debate this about, wanting to pay back the debt, wanting to repair, wanting to offer retribution. So that's a kind of balance sheet across time.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know what you thought, how corrosive is that version, that sequential
what,
version of
reparations?
Well, and that sort of style of thinking about this, about how the present, there's damage to be repaired.
I believe in reparations and repatriation. I think that's different. I think when you mention the word reparations in Britain, everyone clutches their pearls and goes, "Oh my God!" And I get it too. I mean, there was a judge at the International Court of Justice recently who said we owe £18 trillion in reparations for slavery, and I did think, I believe in reparations, but that's not going to happen. We can't even build HS2. We cannot pay £18 trillion in reparations. But there's also a tendency to argue that it's an abstract, absurd argument. But I think we've actually been engaged in reparations as a country without realizing it. I would say our relationship with Ireland has been reimagined through a process of post-colonial truth and reconciliation. I would argue that the Good Friday Agreement involved apologies, involved the payment of reparations, and it's also resulted in a much more positive relationship. We were forced by the descendants of the Mau Mau insurgents to go to court, and we would be paid £20 billion in compensation. We were forced to do it by a court, but those were reparations. William Hague stood up as a foreign secretary and said sorry, and that's resulted in a better relationship with Kenya. There was a recent royal tour to Kenya where the king talked about these issues, and I think it was the only sane royal tour of my lifetime. And so I think we've started this process. We just need to do it for about 50 other countries.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And the balancing metaphor is actually being used now to discredit the whole idea of reparations. If you want to audit the empire financially, you come up with a sum that's so ridiculous that people are saying the whole idea is not credible and not feasible. So these different and alternative and successful versions of reparations are quite right. I think have happened and set the precedent for more.
And people often say in your area slavery, like, what are you going to do? You're going to force the Africans who are involved in slavery to pay reparations. Actually, you'll know this. The grassroots conversation in West Africa, that is being discussed. So it's not that freakish a suggestion.
Yeah, and much depends on exactly right, the economic position of the various different former regions of the British Empire. I mean, the economies of West Africa are growing faster than the economies of the Caribbean, for example. So the next question was, since this is the inaugural Lancaster History Lecture and a literary festival, I wanted to get some sense of you about, having written in so many different formats, what are your reflections on writing as a historian? Because I think at the end of your book, you basically say, I realised that I have been a historian this whole time.
Accidental historian.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can choose different formats to make these points, but, what are the strengths and weaknesses, challenges, opportunities of using history?
My advice to you, by the way, if you want to be a writer, is don't do what I did. You should find one genre you're good at and become known for it. Generally, that's how people make it. I've switched so many genres. And for me, part of the appeal is about writing, is about feeling slightly intimidated at the beginning of it, thinking, I don't know how to write a memoir. I don't know how to write a history book. At one point, I didn't even know how to read a history book because I found them so boring. And I don't mean to be facetious in front of a history writer, but history writers don't focus on the things I care. They don't focus on human beings necessarily, and relationships and feelings, and also they assume a lot of knowledge. Is that fair to say? And so, if you don't read a lot of history books, it's quite difficult to begin reading history books because they're designed for. And so I found that very difficult. But it felt really good to kind of work out how to do that genre. And I now know that, like in all genres, there's good history books, well-written ones, and there's really badly written ones. And there's a huge spectrum. So I've forgotten what you asked me now.
That was it. Yeah. I mean, I guess what I was trying to get your view on is, what role does academic history play in all of this? I accept that it's not going to have the same readership as some of the things that other historians have offered. But you're very positive about history as a discipline in the books, and frankly, you're creating a pipeline of students for us. So we're very grateful. But what role does the academic study of history play?
I think academic history is everything. I mean, frankly, I don't do much primary research, and quite often people beat me up about it and say, "Oh, you don't do your primary research." But actually, Seeley, the original imperial historian, he didn't do any primary research. He was doing a survey and he's pretty much doing what I was doing. And I think there's room in the market for both. I thought that historians would really resent me for using their work and talking about it and selling more copies than them. But not a single historian I've mentioned has complained about it. And I've realized that actually a lot of them don't want to do what I do because they're really interested in their niche and they want to stay in that niche. And actually, quite rightly, they're scared of the media. They don't want to go on BBC Hard Talk and or they don't want to engage the Daily Mail. And I totally understand that. But I guess that's something I can do. But I always try, I hope you feel that I always try to, at every stage, credit academic historians for the really important work they do.
No, absolutely. Great. No, that was
You're very self-effacing.
No, you've taught me how to do that. All that praise has made me self-effacing.
You're about to have a blockbuster, so you'll be all over the Daily Mail soon.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you. So writing Empire Land and Empire World, you've been pretty clear about this. You're not a combatant in the culture wars. That's what you've said. I am,
because it's a bit like a playground fight. It's like, who started it?
Yeah.
People on the left say the right started, the right say the left started it. I get accused of being a culture warrior all the time. And I think you can apply that. If you're on the right, you're going to think that. The point about culture wars is that they are unending. They do not end. It's about having a constant state of enragement. This is what Trump's about. He doesn't want to win the debate. He just wants his followers to be enraged. And the same is true on the left and the right. And I totally accept that for some people, I'm a culture warrior, but I would say, as a culture warrior, I have turned up with my receipts. I've turned up with a highly referenced academic book, whereas Jacob Rees-Mogg spouting shit on GB News, less so. Didn't he say that some of the Boer War, the camps were no worse? The situation in the Boer War camps was no worse than it was in Birmingham at the same time. I mean, that's not academically or historically literate, is it?
Yeah.
So I would say
So you're armed by academic practice in the war.
Hopefully I'm a more intellectually rigorous culture warrior than Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Yeah. You're so good at this, you worked out my question before I had a chance to ask it. But now it's time to hear from the audience. Thank you, Sathnam.
No one ever wants to ask the first one, and then people don't stop. Oh, there we go. First question.
So what's happened has happened. Going forward, what would your advice be in terms of how the country can now use that to create a positive reputation and maintain that positive reputation in the world?
Britain?
Yeah.
What can it do? I think it needs to engage, just begin engaging with the world, because the world wants to, a lot of former imperial territories want to talk about this. For example, the CARICOM group of countries. I think it's a group of 15 nations, 15, 12? I'm assuming you know.
I think it's slightly smaller than that. Yeah.
And I don't think there's ever been a formal... They've come up with a list of requests for reparations, explaining in a very clear way why they're requesting what they're requesting. I don't think the British state has ever even responded. Other countries have. So we just need to reply. We need to start engaging India with the conversation about decolonization. We also need to stop turning up to countries thinking that they're going to like us, which is what happens. And you see this all the time, don't you? I mean, I see it quite a lot. I see it in TV where British journalists turn up in India expecting that locals will have the same rose-tinted view of the British Empire and being shocked when they don't. So we need to get less deluded about our own history as well. But mainly we need to engage in a more meaningful way with these conversations. And we're way behind the international conversation because other countries are doing it. You know, the Dutch are I think there's a formal apology for slavery from Holland. The Dutch royal family have apologized and commissioned research. The Belgian Parliament have commissioned a special commission to look into their history of colonialism and talk about reparations. Germany have paid reparations of a sort. The international conversation has left us behind. So we need to catch up. Thank you for the question.
Hi. In those countries that you've just referred to, would you say that the media is willing to give a more nuanced picture of the situation? Because it would occur to me that, generally speaking, the media increasingly thrives on black and white, this and that, and perhaps 1 minute sound bites. So is there a difference occurring in those places?
That's a really good question, and I agree with you. I think one of the problems in Britain, from my perspective, and for historians, is that, you know, the media in this country is right. I'm a part of the media. It's a right-wing media. There's a disparaging of the profession of the historian, isn't there? I mean, trolling of people like Corinne Fowler, who wrote the National Trust report into colonialism. I mean, at one point I had to call the police. She became too scared to walk down the street. It was libelled regularly in the Daily Mail and the Daily Telegraph. And so I think there's a corrosive atmosphere in the media, which means that people at will can't do their work or can't expect to be received in a sane way by the mass media. I don't know what the situation is in Europe. I suspect it's not quite as rampant. The British media is intense just in terms of the number of outlets, but also I think there is a right-wing bias towards our media. But I should say, in defense of Britain, we're not the worst at this. The country with the worst problem with imperial nostalgia and a terrible media is, of course, Russia, which is so nostalgic about its imperialism that it's invaded Ukraine and has a state-controlled, insane media. So it could be worse. Gosh, that's a really good question. I don't know what Will would say, but I'm going to get you to answer this. It's possible to provide a precise answer, but I would say probably the geopolitics. Because, you know, look at the countries that we permanently fucked up. Nigeria, Sudan, Myanmar, Iraq, Kashmir. We sold Kashmir. It's a Muslim-majority state. We sold it to a tyrannical Hindu monarch. We knew he was insane. And guess what? It's still screwed up. Israel-Palestine. I mean, these are things that continue to screw up people's lives. And I would say the geopolitics is the biggest legacy of all. What would you say, Will? Put you on the spot.
I think separating out politics and economics in this context is very difficult. I think, you know, it's just the back of the conversation we've been having. You know, the imperial nostalgia is, you know, it doesn't kill people as obviously as some of the things that we've been talking about, but it's a very difficult force to challenge, I would say.
How differently do you think the whole empire thing would have gone if it wasn't for Christianity? Because I know, like, in business ethics, we're taught that, like, the Protestant work reformation was the catalyst for the capitalist systems that we have now, and that it was the biblical teachings of evangelism that were the driving force behind the conversion programs.
Very good question. I think Christianity was definitely a major factor in the spread of British imperialism, but it was only one factor. I mean, there was so many different phases of empire. There's one phase of empire in, you know, before, I guess, the late 19th century, where the British weren't particularly concerned with spreading Christianity, and then actually the missionaries were opposed by the East India Company, who just wanted to make money. So Christianity was not a dominant explanation for the empire. And one curious side effect of the spread of Christianity, which I didn't understand until I wrote Empire World, was actually the spread of Islam in West Africa as a legacy of the British Empire. Because what happened is that so many people were converted to Christianity that actually some people saw Islam as a quite useful alternative. Because unlike Christianity, they didn't have to change a lot of their customs. They could continue with a polygamous marriage. They didn't have to start dressing a different way, speaking English. So actually there was a huge expansion in Islam in West Africa at the time where the British were spreading Christianity. So that's a very peculiar, contradictory legacy. We're going to force you to earn your steps today.
Yeah, I really like what you said about complexification of history, and I think that obviously that makes a lot of sense here in the kind of academic history context. We all like nuance and details, but I also think there's a value of simple stories as well. Like that's what communities and identity is built upon. So I wonder, could you take a stab at what would be? Is it possible to tell a simple story about British history and identity now, like an alternative simple story about British history and identity?
Gosh, that's a big question, isn't it? I think on the macro level, it has to be complex. But yeah, you can tell individual simple stories all the time about individual nations, individual people. But I don't think there's any getting over the complexity of it all. And I struggle with, people like on both sides. So Sashi Tharoor's book, sold lots and is hugely popular in India. But I think it's too simple. And actually, I think it takes away the humanity of the people involved in empire. Because Indians reacted to empire in hugely different ways. Some of them did well out of it. Some of them defied it. Some of them were crushed by it. But the idea that imperialism was only ever bad for India, I think, is too simplistic. But it's a very heady narrative to sell to a superpower like India, which has no interest. And now you've got this odd situation where someone like Modi is decolonizing India, but he includes the British and the Mughal emperors in the same overly simplistic narrative. Even then, he's being too simple. So I would say you should seek nuance wherever you are. Whenever you think you're coming to a simple conclusion, I think you should challenge yourself, because I guarantee you there will be some complexity. Go ahead.
Books, how much complacency have you come across amongst people who think that we've done a really good job of confronting colonialism and racism? My impression is that we've become very complacent as a nation, as a political class actually as well, which leads to these comments that we are, world leading in various areas, perhaps also in being multicultural. It strikes me that we've had a bit of a rude awakening in some cases.
Yeah, the complacency is endlessly shocking. I mean, one of the most shocking moments is Tony Blair's memoir, where he writes about handing back Hong Kong to the Chinese, and he says, I was only dimly aware of the history. It's like, oh my God, you're handing back a colony that we got because of the Opium Wars, which is taught to every Chinese child. They talk about the century of humiliation. Every Chinese person knows about this. How can you go and be on that public platform and say you're only dimly aware of the history? But there's another, the royal tour to the Caribbean recently, Prince William and Kate, going to the Caribbean, where they've been talking about how slavery has ruined their societies in so many ways. And they go and they stand on the back of a Land Rover and they wave at the locals, and they touch the fingers of black children through a wire fence. And then they're shocked when that goes down badly across the world. But that went down even badly with the Daily Telegraph. And I think that was a really interesting moment, that even the Daily Telegraph realised that something had changed, but the royal family hadn't. And there basically wasn't a tour again until Kenya, which was completely different. So there is that complacency, but I think they've had to face up to it. So even the royal family are doing things differently now.
Thank you. My question is, from the standpoint and the interest of the lower class of Indian society, such as which one is more cruel? the Indian ruler of their time and British colonists. I mean, if they are equally cruel, I mean, well, this kind of a narratory of telling stories, like it feels like India just one person, but India has like more than 1 billion people. I think. I mean, if they are equally cruel to the lower class, I mean,
yeah. I think if I'm right, you're saying that, you know, given so many people repressed in Indian society by the system, was that repression worse than what the British did? Is that kind of what you're saying?
I mean, from their standpoint, I mean, from the lower class of the Indian society, I mean, if you keep telling the story about the Indian, this kind of nationality, and it's not just a Indian story, it's also a Chinese story, a British story. I mean, it's sort of it looks like the whole countries have the same interests, but it's not, basically. Yeah. But when we talk this kind of stories or narratives, I mean, I feel like many people are being sort of kidnapped by the story.
I think I know what you're saying, but as ever, I'm going to say that it's complicated. And, you know, the legacies of what the British did, say, with caste, you know, are interesting because you can actually trace what happened and what the results are by the fact that the British were totally in control of some areas of India, but some areas they gave to the Maharajas and the princely states who did the ruling. And if you look at how things turned out in those areas in the modern day, the places that were run by the British actually had less religious violence and more caste violence. Places run by the princely states, it was the other way around. So it's like choose your repression, you know. It depends, you know. But yeah, the answer, as ever, is it was really complicated. Are some of your students in the audience?
They are, yep.
Have you forced them to ask questions?
I forced them to attend.
Oh, that's harsh, man.
Yeah, I should have gone further.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I tried to go into this kind of refreshingly free of preconceptions, which is to say I hadn't read the book before I came. And the title made me a little bit uneasy, I suppose, because on first encountering it, I thought to myself, you know, there's a way in which I suppose whatever view you take of the British Empire, it could kind of feed a sense of British self-importance. You know, no matter what happened, we were at the centre of it and we were the agents causing these enormous changes. And now, having seen your talk, that sense of unease has kind of dissipated somewhat because I realise that's not quite what you're
doing. Sale?
Yeah. But I thought another interesting question to ask then might be, how long do you think we'll keep on living in Empire World?
Gosh, that is a good question. On one hand, obviously forever, but because it was a British Empire in human history, and also our failure to confront it means it just goes on and on. It's a constant dysfunction. But I'm going to say something optimistic and say it might be over this year, because I really do feel that my book came out at the start of the culture war in Empire, and it was accidentally timely. And I feel like the second book's come out, and I feel like it's the beginning of the end of the culture war in Empire, because even the politicians still doing it, they haven't really got conviction. It's basically Jacob Rees-Mogg on GB News. Even Keir Starmer, who never wants to say anything controversial, even he has defended the National Trust the other day, you know. And I feel there's always been a gap between what the politicians bang on about and what the country cares about. The surveys suggest that the country haven't got no time for this culture war. They're quite liberal. 2/3 to 3/4 of people think it's a good idea to teach kids about slavery and colonialism. And this culture war is a political thing. And I think with the end of this government, it's going to end this culture war. It might be overly optimistic.
Sathnam, for your books. My question actually is for Will.
You can do this, Will.
I can pass it back to you.
I've learned everything in history. I grew up in India, so this is not news for me. I've learned everything. When my children are at uni now, but when are my grandchildren going to learn about all this? I mean, what are the historians in England doing about this? That's my question. Really.
Right, thank you. Yeah.
No, I think because of skilled writers and communicators like Sathnam, that's creating a broader audience and some additional importance for the sort of work that we're doing. And it's a very liberating thing for us, some of us, to be able to do the academic research that we're doing and reach out to some of these public debates, which historians aren't necessarily used to doing or that good at. So this has created a huge opportunity for professional historians. And I would say something else, that fake news, culture wars has made rigorous academic inquiry even more important. This debate has to be informed by high quality information, and that's hopefully where we come in.
Yeah, it's a weird feeling because basically my career has benefited from culture war, but it's actually ruined my sanity. And what would you prefer? I'd rather live in a sane country and be less successful, frankly. But I think we're getting that way.
Not like Mr.
No, I don't want to be like him.
There are two parts to the question. One is, basically, I would somewhat disagree with what you said about Kashmir. Dogra dynasty has always ruled Kashmir. It was a Hindu majority state. Muslims were servants in their houses, etc., and then the numbers grew. And when India was partitioned, the Dogra signed the letter of accession to the Indian Union. That's one factual, I think that's disagreement.
It is one of the most poisonous controversies in the world, so I accept that there are multiple points of view.
It's complicated.
Complicated?
Yes. Secondly, do you feel the Commonwealth is relevant in this day and age? Because when the Commonwealth was formed, there was free movement. As you said, they could be granted citizenship of this country, and and the pound was equal to a rupee, in those days. Now it's 102 rupees to the pound. So we go to India, and I don't think the people there feel that the Commonwealth is relevant because there's no free movement. There's nothing at all. Yeah. It's a legacy which the monarchs like.
I don't think it's ever been relevant. I don't think it ever was. I mean, when Nehru famously let India join the Commonwealth, he sold it to his cabinet on the grounds that it didn't mean anything. So we might as well join anyway. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. But, it's an institution of mostly former British imperial states, but actually they're not even, nowadays you can join if you weren't part of the British Empire. Like I think Rwanda and Togo were never part of the British Empire. You could say, it's a collection of countries where they share a monarch. Only a fraction of the Commonwealth states have King Charles as the monarch now. I think Enoch Powell called it a gigantic farce, and it still is. And nowadays, the Commonwealth Games, which was the only thing that really meant anything, no one wants to put on the Commonwealth Games anymore, apart from Birmingham, which has gone bankrupt. So it's really an institution that means less and less.
Is this last question, Bill?
Right. Obviously, I'm not an historian, I'm a geographer, so I'm looking at geopolitics, and obviously modern day is China. I mean, there's been many empires besides just Britain. But the modern one is China in South America and South Africa. What influence do you think the British have had on all these other empires? Have we been the leaders? Have people followed us? What kind of inspiration have we been to the rest of the world?
A very good question from a geographer. You're probably an imperial historian by accident. You can see in America how in America the British Empire was an inspiration for quite a few presidents and leaders. I mean, White Man's Burden, the poem by Rudyard Kipling, which no one really reads out nowadays, but Boris Johnson probably knows it word for word. That poem, very racist poem, was written by Rudyard Kipling, a famous British imperialist, as an example to the Americans, saying, look, you can do in the Philippines what we've done in India. And as I argue in Empire World, the British Empire was a massive inspiration for white supremacists in South Africa America, Australia, and as an idea, it had a huge amount of influence in shaping the League of Nations, arguably the UN. But nowadays, you see, you mentioned China. What is China doing? It's buying up massive influence in Africa. It's following the model of the British Empire. And I would say a lot of modern empires are basically copying elements of the British Empire. But I would say that, wouldn't I?
Okay, thanks. I mean, in the books,
Sathnam makes it clear how literary festival audiences don't always go the Q&A as he wants it to. But but what you've just witnessed is an absolute masterclass in how to deal with a range of brilliant questions. So thank you so much, and thank you to Sathnam. We'll leave a round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you both, Sathnam, for that terrific and very entertaining and witty and incisive lecture, and Will for your diffident but perceptive questions, and to all of you for your questions. The only things left to do now are to say that this brilliant book, and the lecture was based on a chapter towards the end, is on sale outside, and every copy you buy supports the work of Litfest. And there are a very few programs left because we've done such a good job of distribution and you've done such a good job of picking them up that there's only a small pile left on the table outside, and next to it is a white leaflet with photographs on it, including George Monbiot at the Environment Lecture last year, and it says it's a scheme for becoming a friend of Litfest and donating regularly, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, our grants help, but none of the things on their own is enough, and we need your support as well. So do pick up a friend's leaflet as you go past the desk where the books are, and please donate to our volunteers who will be holding buckets and boxes to collect those fivers that you've lost the use for. So once again, please join me in thanking Sathnam Sanghera for this first Lancaster History Lecture and Will Pettigrew for his moderation.